I'll just give a brief introduction. Welcome, everybody. I'm Samantha French. I'm the director here at Blaine County Museum, and I'm so pleased to see such a wonderful turnout for our very brief introduction, or I guess our very brief speaker series. We have two speakers, the first of which is Austin, and then on February 9th we'll have Anthony Wood. He'll be over at the library. This speaker series, including Austin, is sponsored by Humanities Montana. So I would like to, thank them at the top here for providing the funding to put on this series and also the advertising for it. A couple housekeeping things. If you could keep your phones off or turn to silent throughout the presentation, that would be appreciated. Also, I don't think that we'll have much of a problem with this, but no need to record anything. We do have a wonderful person here who has agreed to film this entire talk. But our speaker tonight, who will be kicking off our speaker series, is Austin Haney. Austin Haney was the ranger at Bear Paw Battlefield for 2 seasons this past summer, and then 2 summers ago. So he worked as an interpreter telling the story of the Nez Perce flight in Bear Paw Battlefield. He's very, very good at what he does. Even off the clock, he kind of lives and breathes history. He is a very avid researcher. He also does historical reenacting. And Austin put this presentation together after a conversation that we had. I had hoped that he could help the museum a little bit with some of its interpretation. The history that's represented here of Blaine County really doesn't go back that far in terms of human history. It goes back to maybe the 1870s. But as Austin will illustrate this evening, human history here goes back quite a lot further than that. And he's going to be looking at a window of approximately the 1690s through the 1800s. And he's going to be able to tell us a lot about this area that we all call home. So I'll call that good for as far as my introduction goes. And if you could all welcome me in assist me in welcoming Austin. Sorry. Welcome me to okay, all right, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Sam, and thank all of you guys for coming out here on a very cold northern Montana evening. I rather miss it. We've got quite strong Chinooks down in Great Falls right now. It's good to experience some real winter. So like Sam said, we're going to be covering a lot of very interesting history that really doesn't get talked about a whole much in this part of the state. Montana history, unfortunately, sometimes has a tendency to be boiled down to Lewis and Clark, the gold rush, Little Bighorn, and then maybe the copper mining period if we're lucky. And oftentimes, this part of the state that we call home kind of gets ignored. And as somebody who's grown up in the north central part of the state, who's lived here his whole life, there's no more fascinating history out here than what we've got in our backyards. Some of the most fascinating people, the most interesting stories happen right here. And I just hope that we can kind of give more attention to that. So without further ado, guys, let's see what's in the shadow of the Bear Paws. Of course, there's a lot of different people who call this area home. It's been that way for centuries, if not millennia. And the Northern Plains particularly, this is a crossroads of many different types of indigenous peoples. You've got Algonquin-speaking groups, Siouans, you have Shoshonean peoples, all out here kind of mixing in the north central plains. Of course, that little white star right there, if you can see my mouse, that's where we are right now, Chinook. Some of the people in our immediate vicinity, starting around here, we are in kind of the homeland of the Gros-Ventres, the Assiniboines. Historically speaking, this is sort of what the map would look like all throughout the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. Of course, you've got agricultural people, Mandans, Hidatsas, Arikaras, Sioux and Cheyennes down towards the Black Hills, the Crow, inhabiting kind of this area stretching south of the Missouri River kind of centered by the Yellowstone. Shoshones in the southwest, Salish, Nez Perce, Pend Oreille, Kootenai to the west, and then our friends the Blackfoot and the Cree towards the north. And a lot of shuffling, a lot of moving goes on in this time. You have a lot of different people kind of ebbing and flowing throughout the state at the time. At times, the Shoshone, they pushed far north into this part of Montana that we traditionally consider kind of this Blackfoot, Crow, Gros Ventre, Cree, Assiniboine area. A lot of that is due to just getting horses before anybody else. So the Shoshones are an interesting group of people. They speak a sorry, my English isn't working right now. I might have to speak French in this program. But they speak an Uto-Aztecan language. Notice that second half, Aztecan. What does that tell you? It goes way far south. All the Great Basin peoples, they are Uto-Aztecan speakers. They're related to the Shoshones. And as such, they have connections going far south through trading hubs as far as the Spanish settlements in New Mexico. So horses come up this way from the Shoshones moving south towards the north. And they push a lot of these other tribes out of the way, entering kind of this northern plains as far as the South Saskatchewan up here where Lethbridge, Alberta is today. So a couple things here, guys. Gifts from Napiquan. Napiquan is a Blackfoot word for a white person. Dog days. Before the horse, everyone was moving around this area on foot and carrying their livelihoods, their homes, all of their materials they needed to live on the backs of dogs. All that changes again with the arrival of the horse through the Shoshones. And for this sort of 50-year period in the middle half of the 1700s, the Shoshones really dominate out here. But all that starts changing in the 1780s. Of course, we've got the great pox. This is smallpox. We had a little thing 2 years ago called coronavirus, COVID, you know. That really changed things in a lot of ways, didn't it? Now imagine what smallpox would do 200 years ago for people who have no immunity, who have no experience with this disease. Some estimates record that nearly 2/3 of people on the plains would be gone from the smallpox epidemics. And there's another gift from Napiquan working its way south from the north. Guns. The combination of disease, guns in the hands of their enemies, it pushes the Shoshones back towards the southwest, towards the Snake River Plains of Idaho. And of course, where do those guns come from? Traders. And the first Europeans in this area, they come out of the north. They come from Canada. And the first one out of all of them is this adventurous young man by the name of Henry Kelsey. Who's heard of him before? I'm not surprised. Henry Kelsey, he's in his early 20s. The Hudson Bay Company at this point, founded 1670. They are a new up-and-coming fur trade interest in North America. And they really have this system where they just kind of sit on Hudson Bay and hope that people come to them with their furs. Now, I don't know about you, but if I was a Plains Indian living here in sort of north-central Montana, southern Saskatchewan, Alberta, do I really want to go on a trip to the Arctic shores of Hudson Bay? Winter's bad enough here. I don't know. But to drum up more business, they get this genius idea. Why don't we send this young and enterprising man to meet some of our customers, to encourage them to come down to the bay to show what we have to offer. Show them our nice fine guns, our burning glasses, our cooking pots, all these goods that make life easier. As I used to say at one of my old Park Service jobs down at Bent's Old Fort, people nowadays are not too different from people back then. we all like to shop. And so the Hudson Bay Company, they are trying to, in the days before commercials, they got to go out and do their own advertising. So Kelsey heads up the Saskatchewan River all the way up into the South Plains of Saskatchewan. He gets, depending on who you read and kind of the translation, if you will, of his distances, the guy was a good fur trader. He was not a good measurer of mileage. So depending on who you ask, Kelsey may have gotten within about 100 miles of where we're standing today, which is pretty incredible for 1690. And no one knows about him. But one of my favorite things about Kelsey is he meets this group called the Niwotami Poets. We know he meets the Assiniboines, but there's some controversy over who the Niwotami Poets are. Some say they're Grovants, which I'm in that camp. I think he met Grovants. Some people think he met the Blackfoot. But either way, he described them as an interesting people. They do not know the use of canoes. No horses yet. But he notes that they live in a very productive country. And he describes this beautiful passage where he talks about coming out of the aspen parkland up in Canada onto the Great Plains as we know them. He describes these just prairies full of wild roses. It's a real beautiful passage. In addition to that, he's the first European that we know of to see a grizzly bear. It's kind of interesting. So, what does the Hudson Bay Company do with this glowing report from Kelsey? Nothing. They weren't exactly hot to trot in terms of getting their business out. So for about this 40, 50-year period, the Hudson Bay Company does nothing. They kind of choose to sit on their laurels and let people come down to the bay to them. All that changes in 1754. They finally send out a guy by the name of Anthony Haney. He's another guy like Kelsey. He's brought out, he goes as far as modern Alberta. Still no Montana people yet, but we're getting there. Unlike Kelsey, Haney actually lets this pattern go forward. Every year after that point, Hudson Bay sends somebody to trade out on the northern plains. And the problem is they always pick very good fur traders. They don't pick guys who actually know how to calculate mileage. So unfortunately, we have zero clue how close they got. But what can you do? All that finally, thankfully, changes with a fellow by the name of Peter Fiddler and David Thompson. They're two guys that actually know how to calculate distance. Amazing how important that is. So all you folks there, as you're on your road trips, if you can calculate mileage, you would have been a very good explorer. So give yourself a pat on the back. And it's these peddlers amongst the Blackfoot that really start to establish firm connections towards the northern edges of Montana. By the time Lewis and Clark get here, there are already fur traders who have probably been south of the 49th parallel. And this is where this very interesting map comes into play. This is one of my favorite pieces from that Hudson Bay legacy. This is drawn by Peter Fiddler in 1802. It is from information supplied by a Blackfoot named Akamoki. And Akamoki is very well traveled. He knows the Blackfoot homeland. And unfortunately, I can't rotate this for you guys here, but essentially, this right here is the main kind of divider between where we're at now. You've got rivers flowing into Hudson Bay. You've got the Milk River right here. You see those three little circles right there? The Sweetgrass Hills. And this is the early version. So essentially, right down here, you have the Rocky Mountain front, basically between Great Falls and Calgary, Lethbridge area. So Akamoki decided to give Fiddler some more information. And on a second map drawn by Fiddler from his information, you have the first written reference to the bear paws. And notice I say bear paw. Some people are like, it's bear's paw. The first written reference that I can find comes from Peter Fiddler. He says bear paws, and so therefore I use bear paws. Granted, he is Canadian. I have an affinity for that, so do with that what you will. You can still call him bear's paw. So,
what is it, plural bear's paw or possessive bear's claw?
So bear's paw, it's named after a butte, a particular formation. Yep.
So it's a possessive.
So it's the bear's paw, yep. The bear's paw.
Thank you.
So, yep. But Fiddler recorded it as the bear paws, so that's what I use. So Fiddler was going off of Akamakie's sort of information, but other people were going off of Fiddler's information. In fact, there you have it right there, Mr. Fiddler going out, 1792. This map is done by a fellow named Aaron Arrowsmith. He's a very famous London cartographer, did a lot of maps throughout the 1780s, 90s, into the early 1800s. And you guys have probably been wondering, why is this guy talking about Canadians so darn much if we're here to talk about north central Montana? There's a very important reason. All this information is compiled into a master map of the American West, the best one available in the year 1800. We have the King, Chief Mountain. Mukawan, that's the Belly River. Again, this is all southern Alberta. But if you were to look down below here, he's got the Three Paps, the Sweetgrass Hills. He's got the Bear's Tooth, the Sleeping Giant, if you know Helena area. But he's got all these features marked out from Akamakie's information from Fiddler's map. And this particular example that we're looking at right here is very interesting in terms of who owned it. This is taken a scan off of one in the collection of the Library of Congress. If you look in the bottom corner very closely, it says property of Meriwether Lewis. That's why we're talking about these guys. They directly informed Lewis and Clark what they might find out here and sort of how the land might have lied. Of course, they didn't know everything. They had a couple issues. The Rocky Mountains were one big chain going down the center. They didn't really talk about the Bear Paws. They didn't really talk about the high woods or these island ranges. And they sure as heck didn't tell them that the Missouri didn't go all the way to the Pacific Ocean. But two very important figures in Montana history, indeed in the history of the American West. Lewis and Clark were big coffee hounds, so I think they'll be okay with me doing that. Of course, Meriwether Lewis, William Clark, the iconic dynamic duo. You can't really talk about Montana history without mentioning them. They first make it into the state in April of 1805, passing the mouth of the Yellowstone River and heading up the Missouri. They get to the Milk River near Glasgow. This is the first time they've ever seen it. The Hidatsas of North Dakota had told them that it would be the river that scolds at all others. They thought it to be quite the crazy river. Of course, being from North Dakota, I can see why they'd be a little scared of our Milk River out here. Please don't tell my North Dakota friends I said that. But they think that, okay, this is the last major river on the north side. They have no idea about the Marias. But as they're going through the Missouri breaks, through places submerged by Fort Peck Dam, occasionally hunters who are sent out on the high bluffs there, they're looking west and they start seeing these weird blue shapes coming up out in the distance. The island ranges. And of course, William Clark, May 19th, he says, I ascended the highest hill I could see, saw the mouth of Musselshell River and the meanderings of the Missouri for a long distance. I also saw a high mountain in a westerly direction, about 40 or 50 miles distant. This is the earliest that we know of the sighting of the Little Rockies in the Bear Paws. Joseph Whitehouse, a private with the expedition. Some of the party yesterday discovered a high range of mountains off to the west, a long distance off. And of course, Lewis himself, being the first name in Lewis and Clark, he's got to take credit for things. He would say that, he's the guy who saw it first, but notice, May 26th, he didn't see it first. What? Who are you kidding, Lewis? But as he says, I walked out and ascended the river hills, which I found sufficiently fatiguing. Notice, Webster's Dictionary is not a thing in 1805. Makes for some interesting reading. On arriving to the summit of one of the highest points in the neighborhood, I thought myself well repaid for any labor, as from this point I beheld the Rocky Mountains for the first time. I hate to tell you this, Lewis, but they're not the Rockies. If they had been, maybe they would have gone all the way to the Pacific and back in a year. Would have been a lot easier than what it turned out to be. Because, of course, that one range of mountains stretching down there, that doesn't look like one range of mountains to me. And, of course, this is sort of the beginning of American knowledge of the West. So thank you, Lewis. Thank you, Clark. Thank you, all the people on that expedition, because you're going to set the stage for our next chapter here, this being fur traders. Now, the thing about the 1810 map of the West, this is as good as it's going to get for another 50 years. Essentially, the U.S. government forgets about this place for a couple reasons. One of them being the Blackfoot. Lewis, of course, running into a small party of them near modern Browning, Montana, and they did not exactly have a good welcome home party, if you will. The other reason being the Arikaras down here in South Dakota. You've got two tribes that are really not interested in having all of these white people start coming to their lands. So essentially, the first mountain men who come west, they start diverting themselves south to get to the west. They pioneer a little thing called the Oregon Trail. So for a while, no one's really coming up here. That all changes in the 1820s. The upper Missouri starts to become the focal point. This had been the jewel that had long been denied them by the Blackfoot, by the Arikaras. The first guy to come out here is a very, very interesting figure in fur trade history, a man by the name of William Ashley. Everyone called him General. But General Ashley decided to put out a newspaper ad, much like the Hudson Bay guys, got to advertise for things you want. And so these 100 men come up with Ashley up the river to begin fur trapping. You might recognize some of the names. People like Jim Bridger. That's when he first comes to the West. Jedediah Smith. Hugh Glass. All very famous mountain man names. And so they come up to the Yellowstone, build a fort, Fort Henry, and they start sending parties up into north central Montana. They got guys heading towards the Milk, guys heading as far as the Smith River. There's only one problem. It's our good friends, the Blackfoot again. One by one, Ashley's hundreds slowly start becoming not so much 100. And again, it's one of those situations where it's getting more expensive to outfit new fur traders because they keep getting killed than it is to get your furs coming in. So the mountain man mindset, they're going to go out, they're going to trap the furs themselves, bring it down the river or sell it at a rendezvous. That's all fine and dandy. It doesn't make you a lot of money. My friends in the fur trade world, they always give me a hard time. They're like, man, why do you like that Hudson Bay stuff? I'm like, well, because they actually make money. The model, essentially, that worked out was trading. Think of it this way. You're living out here, you've got all these beaver in your backyard, and some strangers start trapping all that wonderful fur that you use to buy stuff from Hudson Bay. How are you going to feel? It's like people taking money out of your wallet. And so there's a lot of hostility towards that. That's why the Blackfoot are so, gung-ho about keeping people out. There's actually this really interesting quote from a Blackfoot chief to a U.S. government Indian agent. He says, "If you send traders, we will keep them as friends and guard them with our lives. But for trappers, never. We will kill them." And so it takes about 15, 20 years for American fur traders to start realizing, maybe we better listen to what they want. Maybe they'll actually buy stuff from us if we do that. And so, funny enough, they poach a bunch of Canadian fur traders and start building fur posts in the Blackfoot country. Fort Union, on the site of old Fort Henry, that's kind of the major hub. Some of the other major ones that we get to talk about, Fort Mackenzie / Fort Pegan, those are the first ones in the upper Blackfoot country near the mouth of the Marias. They're the precursors to Fort Benton that we know today. Fort Chardon at the mouth of the Judith River. Fort Jackson, Van Buren, and Alexander. These ones are kind of interesting. They service the Crows. They're on the Yellowstone. Fort Lewis and Fort Benton, of course, they replace Mackenzie and Pegan. Because the problem is a lot of these places are made out of cottonwood, and as we all know, cottonwood is not really the best of building woods, is it? So you got to keep rebuilding your forts after a while. And speaking of a couple of these places, again, here we are, the little white star in Chinook. Fort Union off over here. This is that Jackson Alexander Van Buren. This is Chardon over here, Pegan, Mackenzie, and eventually Lewis and Benton. Fort Owen, which will actually be St. Mary's Mission originally. And then all these little red ones. These are British fur posts in Montana. Because until 1848, the west side of the divide was jointly occupied. A lot of people didn't know that western Montana was one time technically Canada. But what about this little blue one over here? That's kind of interesting. Did you know that we had a fur post in our backyard? This is actually not really much of a fur trading post. It's more of a sort of a seasonal outlet, if you will. It's kind of like Spirit Halloween. It just goes up in one of those abandoned little shacks for a couple months. You spend your money there and then it goes away. Comes back next year. But this is a little thing called Hamel's House. And Hamel was one of those fur traders from the Pegan area. A lot of these guys, they are former Canadian fur traders. They have familial ties to the Blackfoot, marrying in. So, it's much harder to go and try and kill your brother-in-law than it is some random trader on your land. So, marriage is survival. Some of the spouses here are probably thinking like, I don't know about that. But through the 1830s, the 40s, and into the 50s, every winter, Augustin Hamel, or Hamel, whatever you want to say, he's the guy that comes up and he trades with Gros Ventres and some of the eastern Blackfoot that live up here towards the Cypress Hills. And so this kind of becomes a cool little eclectic fur trading post in our backyard. Unfortunately, the site has never been discovered. I'm almost convinced that it might be under Fresno, which is kind of sad. But the fur trader's life on the Upper Missouri, it really is a seasonal thing, much like Hamel's House. Of course, the main mode of transportation in and out of the region, keel boats and Red River carts. Because one thing that the fur trade does, it creates a new kind of people, the Métis. They are the children of the fur trade, as they're often called. And this part of the world, the Milk River, will become very important to this group of people as time goes on. This area also is very important for the fur traders, not just because of Hamel's House. So keel boats are the line haul freighters of the 19th century. They can haul many, many tons of goods. The only problem is that heavy of a boat, You need certain levels of water to get it up and down throughout the year. This is going to be a problem for the entire time the Missouri is used as a freighting route. You can only do so much with the boats, and then winter comes, it ices over, you're not exactly going to get a boat over a skating rink, are you? And so they need an overland route. That's where the Red River carts come in, and the Métis. The Fur Traders Trail, it is an expressway for delivering freight, messages, personnel between the hub at Fort Union and the posts up here on the upper Missouri. And the route as follows, basically follows Highway 2 that it does today. From Fort Union, you go up the Missouri to the Milk River and then take the Easy Valley all the way to Havre. You take a left turn at Beaver Creek, you follow it all the way to Big Sandy, and bada bing, bada boom, you are home free, basically. And they reckon that you could probably get a heavy loaded wagon column to the area in about 18 days. Not too shabby for walking speed. But if you were on a fast horse, you could accomplish it in maybe 4. And so this became a very well-traveled route. We are literally sitting almost right on top of the old Fur Traders Trail. Essentially, the way this goes, the fur trade year always begins in June. It's high water month. That's when the company's big steamboat makes it to Fort Union. At the same time, all the keel boats from the upper posts, they consolidate their freight, they bring it down to Union, exchanging furs for the trade goods brought up on the company boat. That boat then goes back down to St. Louis, whereas the keel boats make their way back up with this year's trading goods back to the upper posts. And this was kind of the way things went for about 30 years. Even when the steamboats become a thing, this is sort of the seasonal life up here in this part of the world. June is when the steamboats come, and they can get all the way up. But that's for another chapter. And this kind of becomes public knowledge. A fellow by the name of Prince Maximilian de Wied. So Prince Max is a very interesting guy. He's got a lot of money and a lot of time on his hands. So what does he do with it? He decides that he's going to become an ethnologist. He wants to go travel and study people. His last major trek, he was several years through the Amazon rainforest. And his next big adventure, he wanted to go to the upper Missouri and paint scenes of life. And so he hires a Swiss artist by the name of Karl Bodmer. And they come up on the company boat, spend time at Fort Union, and eventually take a keelboat all the way up to what later becomes Fort Benton. So a couple of the images that you've seen in here are Bodmer pieces. That's a Bodmer piece. This is actually the keelboat Flora going up the Missouri. They come into contact with the camp of Gros Ventre. This is down near modern Judith Landing. And the cool thing about a lot of these Bodmer images, you can actually go to the places where they were painted still to this day, and it looks just the same. And this is another great example. There's old Prince Max right there. Very interesting guy. He's got his little German feather in his hat, you know. Imagine being a fur trader or a Native American out on the plains and you see this guy walk up to you and it's like, can he paint your picture? Because this is Bodmer right here. He's got his big shooting bag, but he's probably got some watercolor stashed in there too. This right here is actually a very interesting painting for Lewis and Clark buffs, because this guy right here, you want to take a guess who that might be? His wife's very famous. Charbonneau. That's Charbonneau. So, fun fact, that's probably Charbonneau. But of course, Bodmer captures all these wonderful images of the area before it's going to be changed forever. Starting in the 1840s, you get a lot more attention up here. Like I said before, Lewis and Clark came up, some of the fur traders came up as well, but for the most part, public conscience in that day was largely ignoring this part of the world. I guess some things never change. But all that starts switching out in 1840. You see, some of the Western tribes had been sending delegations for the white man's book of power, if you will, the black robes that had been told to them by some of the fur traders. And so early missionaries start coming out west, amongst them Father Nicholas Point. Now, they establish a mission at what is today Stevensville, Montana. But Point travels frequently to the east side of the divide. He spends a summer and a fall camped with the Blackfoot, with the Grovants. He paints all these wonderful portraits that unfortunately I could not get in this program because the people in Montreal are very touchy about them. But besides the Point, he spends a lot of time painting portraits of people who, very interestingly enough, they still have descendants here today. It's like taking a picture of your great-great-great-grandparents. For a lot of our friends out here on Fort Belknap, those are family pictures. So I wish I could get them. I'm going to make a point of getting them. Of course, east versus west. Then, as now, a lot of development is happening west of the Continental Divide. Everyone likes mountains. I don't know what it is. I'm a prairie guy, personally. But that's where a lot of the initial settlement is taking place. By and large, the old fur trade patterns are still staying the same. Point does eventually decide that, this Western life is a little too hard for me. I need to go back to a nice, cushy church job in Montreal. And so he spends his last fall and winter in the West at Fort Lewis, which will later be named Fort Benton after he's gone. And he sketches a lot of Blackfoot there, as well as people involved with the fur trade, including our friend Augustin Hamel, the guy who runs the house out by Havre. And this kind of sets the stage for the next big event in sort of our story here. The Pacific Railroad Survey. Who's heard of that? Well, I saw one. That's good. Well, it is the greatest exploration in American history that you have never heard about. They had an ambitious plan in the 1850s. We want a transcontinental railroad. The only problem is this is the 1850s. There's a little thing that's going to happen in 10 years called the Civil War. People don't really like each other in the United States in 1853. Again, some things never change. So they get this grand plan. They can't agree on one railroad route, so why not look for 5? And the northernmost of these transcontinental railroad surveys is led by a very interesting little guy by the name of Isaac Stevens. He gets the cushy job of being the railroad surveyor, the Indian commissioner, and the governor of Washington Territory all in one. He's got 200 men under his command, and he is going to basically drag the public conscience along with him to convince them that this is the best railroad in the country. You better do it. He's a very forceful personality. So he heads out from St. Paul, Minneapolis area, starting across the plains, gets all the way through North Dakota, finally hits Fort Union, and now we're in the good stuff. We're in Montana now. So he comes out here and follows the fur trader's trail. He's got Alexander Culbertson, a very important figure who will come up again, so do remember his name. Culbertson, that sounds familiar. Might be a little town in eastern Montana named for him. But Culbertson is sort of the ambassador for the region. He's the fur company's main head honcho. He's the guy who runs Fort Union and Fort Benton. And his wife, Nadoiksa, is Blackfoot. So he's got a free passport basically anywhere he wants to go. And so he leads Stevens and the party through the Milk River Valley following the fur trader's trail. And along the way, they start meeting different groups of people. This right here in the upper right, this is actually Isaac Stevens here and his little buddies meeting with a party of Blackfoot who were going to trade at Fort Union. They were kind of having some trouble with the Grovants there. It's a very interesting story of love and betrayal. I bet you didn't know that we had soap opera quality stories back then. Essentially what it was is a Grovant woman fell in love with it was a Blackfoot woman, married a Grovant man. A Blackfoot man came, killed the Grovant, and tried to take her back to the tribe. She pretended she was like, oh, thank you for taking me back. I didn't like living with the Grovants. They got about 2 miles away. She kicked him in the nose and ran off to tell the Grovants that, hey, we've got trouble. Needless to say, this lover's quarrel actually broke apart an ancient relationship. The Blackfoot and the Grovants had been friends for a long time. They're both Algonquin language speakers. And this severed the Grovants from the Blackfoot Confederacy and made them ally themselves with the Assiniboines. So fun fact, it was a lover's quarrel that got Fort Belknap started, basically. They might have a different version of the story that is, in all honesty, even more fascinating than mine, but this is just the SparkNotes version. So navigating this complicated issue, Stevens does a couple different things. He has small little treaties and then a couple big ones. He's got this grand vision of creating a new order out here in the West. And he's going to execute that in 1855, but that all gets rolling here in the Milk River Valley when he meets with the Grovants. A couple things here. This is actually the Stevens party transversing the foothills of the Bear Paw Mountains. This was taken probably on the kind of corner between Havre and Box Elder area. I would love to actually get that same vista and recreate it with some of my reenacting compadres. But this is the Milk River Valley near Glasgow, and this one is a little further up towards Saco area. And this right here happened over near Harlem. This is the Grand Council with the Grovants. They got together in a slough of the Milk River. And very interestingly enough, they talk about firing off a cannon to impress the natives, and they get the Grovants to not be so upset about what happened, and the Blackfoot are promising we won't do that again, it's okay. It's a great big show, dog and pony show, if you will. And in the evenings, they talk about seeing a comet. It's very interesting. Coincidentally enough, about 2 years ago when I was first here at Bear Paw, I actually went out to this spot and was able to see the same comet, believe it or not. Same time of year. But a fun fact for you guys who live in Chinook, if you head out of town, heading about, you take the old Highway 2, it's past the Elohim Road kind of thing. Am I pronouncing that right? Yeah. Good. Essentially, you go about 3-4 miles out of town and off to your left near one of the creeks that comes in. I can't remember the name of it right now. But on that spot, Isaac Stevens and his men had lunch. But they talk about the Chinook area as they pass through. They called it the Junction. It's where Battle and Lodge Creek come down, and they almost combine, but then they flay out and enter the Milk River. So we are literally in the footsteps of history. Golden dreams. I had golden dreams for this presentation, and you guys being here far exceeded anything I could have thought, so thank you, by the way. But this right here is the earliest photograph of Fort Benton, taken in 1860 by the Reynolds expedition. Probably another group of people that you don't know about because we always focus on Lewis and Clark. Now, this right here, great photograph, one of my favorites. But Fort Benton changes drastically in 1860. The fur trade is playing out. Nobody's really interested in beaver anymore. They're almost extinct. So trade has gone towards buffalo. course, at this time, buffalo, they're very warm. If you've ever had on a buffalo robe, you can attest to that. So Fort Benton is a hub of the robe trade. They're shipping out robes to places like New York City, Montreal, Philadelphia, all sorts of these great eastern towns. And what do you think these eastern folks are using them for? Well, yeah, you can use them as a bed, a blanket, but the most popular is in the wintertime. You know a song called Jingle Bells? So when you're dashing through the snow, come on, guys. Or the fields you go. Nope, wrong. Or the fields you go with a buffalo robe on your lap to keep you warm. They didn't tell you those were the original lyrics, did they? But anyways, the robe trade, this is what it's all about. There's still only keelboats coming up and down this part of the river. It is the keelboaters' kingdom still. All that changes in 1860. You get the first steamboats reaching as far as the Marias. By 1862, they are reaching Fort Benton itself. It becomes the world's innermost port, with an asterisk. You can still only get there in high water months in June and maybe July if you're lucky. So there is a lot of hustle and bustle going on in this part of the world in the summertime when the boats are coming up. But there's a little bit of a problem. When the water goes down, the boats can't come all the way to Fort Benton. So what do? You drop that cargo and you take it overland. Who's heard of Cow Island? Yeah. That used to be the low water drop-off point for steamboat freight coming up the Missouri. And so you drop it off at Cow Island, you get your bull teams coming from Fort Benton, they pick up the freight and they go back. And you know that old saying, all roads lead to Rome? For Montana, it should be all roads lead to Fort Benton. Because from that place, it's the freight hub of the Northwest. You can ship goods over the Mullen Road to as far as Walla Walla. You can ship down towards Helena to the gold camps in Virginia City. You can hit the Judith Basin by going south of Judith Landing. And you can hit the Canadian Northwest. Kind of much to the chagrin of the Hudson Bay Company, all the trade was getting diverted south of the line. Because again, you'd much rather take a boat or a nice wagon ride from Fort Benton than go all the way to frozen Hudson Bay, right? So, of course, trails to fortune. There's a lot of money going over all of these places, and the old fur traders trail is still being used as well. You've got groups like James Fisk coming over from Fort Union, bringing settlers from Minnesota and the upper Midwest. They come out to Montana, settle a lot of them in the gold fields. Some of them actually, including the Noyes family, they actually end up back in this part of the world. So that was for you, Carol.
Thank you.
And I mentioned the Canadian Northwest, the whoop-up country. That is the jewel in the crown, if you will, for freighters in this part of the world. The Cypress Hills up on the Alberta-Saskatchewan border, just literally right north of us. And of course, a lot of stuff is going on. Did I transition at the right point? Yes, I did. So a lot of lawlessness is going on because technically Canada did not own its own Northwest. That was owned by the Hudson Bay Company. And they had a little thing called a royal charter that basically gave them dominion over that land and everything in it. That charter expired in 1869. And so there was a short period where there was really no authority north of the 49th parallel. And our wonderful, enterprising American spirits down in Fort Benton decided to capitalize on it. There were trails leading all over, paralleling modern Highway 89, I-15, 87. All of these modern roads that we know are descended from these old trade trails of the 19th century. And there were a lot of them that went all the way up towards the Cypress Hills, up the Battle and Lodge Creeks that we know today, passing right through Hill and Blaine County. And what was the main commodity that they were selling at that time? Well, after a couple centuries of selling your cooking pots and your lovely wares from the Hudson Bay Company and the American Fur Company, you kind of have enough cooking pots, right? So the main trade commodity, it's a very dark period in our history. It's whiskey. It's whiskey. And not good whiskey either. This is the cheap rot gut stuff that, ooh. Some of the things I've heard in terms of recipes will make you shudder. And there starts to be a lot of violence north of the border. You got these young, rough and tumble young men in the Wild West. You've got Blackfoot who are angry about what's going on. You have no law enforcement. And guns and alcohol don't necessarily breed good, peaceful times. And so 1873, probably the darkest period. It is called the Cypress Hills Massacre. Party of wolfers from Fort Benton, their horses get stolen. They track them far north towards modern sort of Maple Creek, Saskatchewan area in the Cypress Hills. They get up to that point and they come to Mose Solomon's place and Falwell's Tavern up there and essentially decide, well, we're not getting our horses back, might as well get drunk and go home. Well, they get absolutely plastered drunk and decide that group of Assiniboines camped out there, they look awful suspicious. I think they took our horses. They didn't. Words escalate into violence, and several of the Assiniboines are gunned down in cold blood. The Montana whiskey traders retreat back, realizing that this is probably not the best place to be right now. Word of this sneaks all the way back to Ottawa, and the Canadian public's horrified. You've got American traders on Canadian territory, whooping it up, as they used to call it. And so they decide we need law and order in the Northwest. This is the birth of the Mounties. At this time, there is a border survey going on in our county area. Basically, the fun part is if you go up near Turner, you can actually, if you follow the border fence, you can still see some of the remnants of the old border cairns that they made in the 70s. It's pretty crazy. But the Mounties followed right behind them, got as far as the Sweetgrass Hills, and realized, oh boy, we are lost. They go down to Fort Benton to get a guide, get supplies, and remember what I said about all roads lead to Fort Benton? Well, all the news goes through Fort Benton as well. The whiskey traders had known for months prior that the Mounties were coming out. So what do? They get out of Alberta, they come down, and when the Mounties roll into town, they say, oh, we've heard about all this terrible stuff going on up there. We're here to help you if you ever need anything. Here, buy this. And so the whiskey traders go legit, making fortunes that kind of turned them into some of the founding fathers of Montana. You ever heard of the Thomas Power? Yep. The Conrad brothers, Conrad, Montana. The Conrad Mansion in Kalispell. That's all dirty whiskey money. I actually know of a Blackfoot cultural historian who likes to say that 1870s Montana has a lot more in common with drug cartel Mexico than we care to admit. So, interesting stuff. But kind of the way things are going in the 70s, this is a rough and tumble area. There are a couple places out here that we need to know about. Number one, we got Fort Browning near Dodson. Now, we hear the word fort, we automatically think, John Wayne and his little yellow neckerchief cavalryman. Da-da, 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 da-da. I grew up watching those kind of stuff with my grandpa, so it's okay. But it's not. It's a trading place. It's an Indian agency. Another Indian agency at the time, one that will ring a bell. You ever heard of Fort Belknap? Believe it or not, it was actually right here in Chinook initially. And remember our old friend Alexander Culbertson? Well, he had run onto some hard times. He was in his 50s and 60s by this point. And let's just say that he had lost his fortune. Nottawixa left him to go live with the Blackfoot because she couldn't stand living with a poor man. And so he had to take a job at Fort Belknap. So fun enough, one of the most fascinating and important characters in fur trade history. He was right here in Chinook. But at the time, you had connections coming up from Fort Shaw, from Fort Benton, delivering the annual annuities to the Gros Ventres and Assiniboines. And that was sort of the rhythm up here. Soldiers would come, escort the supplies, and then they would go. But the mid-70s are a very tumultuous time, and these are kind of the four main figures that we're going to talk about here. Of course, Chief Joseph, Looking Glass and the Nez Perce, Sitting Bull, and Nelson Miles. Good words and broken promises. That's a very famous phrase spoken by Chief Joseph. Things are starting to change. There are more settlers in the West. There is more development. There's no longer that old delicate balance of fur traders, tribes, and people in between, kind of getting along for the most part. Now it's more forcefully going to be decided that this is the way things are going. One of the big moments here, through the 70s, you've got more railroad surveys. Of course, the Civil War interrupted, didn't really get Isaac Stevens' grand plan into fruition. But all that changes in 1869. They choose the central route. Now all they got to do is rescout the other ones and go from there. So in the 70s, they send, for the Northern Pacific, a couple surveys into Montana. And some of the tribes out there really don't like that. Isaac Stevens was one thing. They found out very quickly that all of his promises didn't really work out so well. It's much to his chagrin, actually, in his own lifetime. He was always embarrassed and furious by the fact that literally within 2 years of his treaties, there were wars all over the Northwest about those treaties. They were not well liked. So people are on their guard. You had, during the Civil War, you had campaigns against the Cheyenne that pushed them north. You had campaigns against the Dakota Sioux that pushed them west and really warned their Lakota cousins, amongst them Sitting Bull, that, you know, maybe we shouldn't trust these newcomers so much. And there are skirmishes all throughout the 1870s between soldiers stationed in Montana, freighters, all sorts of people out here. Basically, tensions are rising. Tensions are rising. That's as good as I can say it. The Blackfoot try and ride the balance, if you will, kind of walk the tightrope, but they are basically punished for a family squabble with the Baker Massacre. 300 people killed in the cold January plains out near Shelby, Montana. Really a really rough part of Montana history, but that ends any trouble on the northern plains. The real problem is going to be in the southeast with the Sioux. They've been pushing in, being pushed by settlers in Minnesota, Dakota. They're getting pushed into Montana, fighting wars with the Crow, with the Assiniboines, Crees. Everybody out here did not like the Sioux. You know it's bad when the Crows and the Blackfoots, who have been basically warring with each other as long as they can remember, both agree that, yeah, we would rather ally with you than deal with the Sioux. So 76, we have this little thing called the Great Sioux War. You might remember it for a little battle called the Little Bighorn. And it is a world-changing thing for all of Montana, all of the West, in fact. Essentially what happens is the Army kind of been playing softball, if you will, before this. After Little Bighorn, they are not messing around. One of the guys that comes up in the aftermath of Little Bighorn is Nelson Miles. He is a very experienced fighter. He had basically fought the Southern Cheyennes to a standstill. He had pacified the Comanches. in Texas, and now his third chance was going to be to come up here and get Sitting Bull. Of course, all throughout the winter of 1876, spring of 1877, he pushes hard. Battle after battle, he eventually convinces the Sioux to go north to Canada. Now, there's only one thing going on. It's the Nez Perce. So things boil over in Idaho. The Nez Perce flee to Montana to try and find a safe haven. Of course, this is not how things work in the U.S. Army's mindset. They are pursued for 1,200 miles over a span of 4 months. And they get here to Bear Paw, and this is where sort of the siege ends. And the guy in charge of that is Nelson Miles. He mercilessly pushes his own regiment of soldiers north out of Miles City area and gets involved with this at the very last second and sort of finishes out what's going on. But not every Nez Perce is captured at Bear Paw. Some of them do make it to Canada. And it's a very interesting moment because right at the same time in Fort Benton you have Alfred Terry. And if you know your Little Bighorn history, that's a very interesting name. Alfred Terry had been the commander of that expedition into Montana that ended with Custer's defeat at Little Bighorn. He's got a little bit of some making up to do for that failure. And so he's put in charge of a commission to go north to Fort Walsh to talk to Sitting Bull in Canada. And of course, this is old Al right here, Mr. Terry, if you will. But some of the soldiers from Bear Paw actually, after the battle, went and escorted Terry to Canada. Some from Big Hole actually had done that as well, for all you Nez Perce buffs out there. But right before they got there, Nez Perce survivors from Bear Paw had come into Sitting Bull's camp. And this is a very famous illustration of the actual proceedings of the Terry Commission. They met with Terry, with the Northwest Mounted Police, and Sitting Bull very famously gets up and basically says, "Why should I listen to you when I have all the proof I need that you will not keep your promises? I have seen with my own eyes how you will treat me. Go away, I'm staying here." And of course, that sort of settles the question for now. With the presence of the Sioux and the Nez Perce up in Canada, the U.S. Army figures we need to fortify the northern border. The Milk River frontier at this time, it's a very, very dangerous place. We have no U.S. military presence. There's very little settlement. They're worried about historically hostile tribes like the Gros Ventres and the Assiniboines, basically possibly having some issues, egged on by the Sioux. They didn't really understand culture that well. There was nothing that would get them to join the Sioux. But essentially what happens is it gets to this point where they need to sort of forcibly change the area. The Métis that I had mentioned, they oftentimes camped on the Milk River. There were settlements all over the valley. Frenchman's Creek, you guys know that one? It's called Frenchman's Creek because there's a lot of Métis up there. There was about 100 or so cabins at one time on Frenchman's Creek of Métis. So 1878, 1879, Miles is up here on the Milk River again. He is arresting Métis, calling them British Indians. You're not our responsibility. Go to Canada. And he kicks them out. He escorts them all the way up to the border and basically tells them, fend for yourself. And there's this great loss of Métis culture here because of that. It's a story that's not often told. At the same time, issues with the Métis, they're up in Canada starting to kind of think about rebelling. That will happen in 1885. But you still got the Sioux, you still got the Nez Perce coming down, hunting in the Milk River Valley. We had the last herds of free-roaming buffalo in the 1870s. They were already hunted out most everywhere else. And so the Army decides that the last thing, the crown jewel to basically get this place how they want it, will be a fort. The largest fort in Montana. Fort Assiniboine, just outside of Havre. They start building that 1878. And by the time it's completed, again, it is the largest military post constructed in Montana. Up to 1,000 men could be put there at any given time. And the idea would be that they would patrol the Milk River Valley, the Canadian border, stretching out east and west from both sides. By that point, they had probably actually built Fort Assiniboine maybe 3 or 4 years too late. It never saw any real action. But that beautiful brick bastion on the plains, it is still kind of cool that we have that. And with that, guys, that sort of brings us up to speed with what happens in the 19th century. Fort Assiniboine really is the closing chapter of the Wild West up here. Shortly thereafter, the Great Northern Railroad in the early 1880s, it stretches out from North Dakota. You have the final defeat of the Métis and the Old Iron Alliance with the Assiniboines and the Crees up in Canada in 1885. Some of the refugees come to Montana and actually settle, getting a reservation at Rocky Boy. So our friends at Rocky Boy, those are all Métis, Cree, Chippewa folks from the Northwest Rebellion. A couple other things here. Of course, we got statehood in 1889. Chinook becomes a town at the same time. There's just a lot of development that happens in the 1880s that really, with the construction of Assiniboine, that allows that to happen, and the chapter of this really interesting mix just closes forever. And I really hope, by the way, just for my own personal thank yous before highlighting some of these folks, I really appreciate you guys coming out here. I was not expecting this many people, and like I said in the Golden Dreams, you guys made it more than I ever could have hoped. I hope you come away with this with some interesting knowledge and curiosity to know more about what happened in our part of Montana. Because you know what? We're special too. We've got some real cool stuff. And with that, thank you, Sam, Blaine County Museum, for having me out here. It's been awesome.
Stevensville, named after Patrick Stevens, and the town of Terry after
Alpha Terry.
Okay.
You'll notice a pattern in Montana names. They're all from Miles City for Nelson Miles. Of course, Culbertson, Montana. You've got Forsyth. He was another interesting figure that doesn't factor anywhere up here, but he's southern Montana. But all the names have some connection to all this history.
Your research, did you ever find anything about any established stage lines along the High Line? I know the spur routes came out for Benton, but most of those went south.
Yeah, those were all connected to the gold fields. There were mail lines between Fort McLeod and Fort Walsh to Fort Benton that just followed the normal freight routes, but mail line, some passenger travel, but nothing really established. It was kind of small scale, informal, because really the only customers you had were Northwest Mounted Police. So, and like I did say, you're welcome to come up here and check out some of the stuff on the table, because it all pertains to what we're talking about.
So where'd the cool hat come from?
Well, which cool hat? The orange one. Oh boy, I'm glad you talked about this. So this is something that would be related to Stevens. This is Stevens' expedition. So of those 200 guys, about 30 of them were U.S. Dragoons, and they wore these. So can you imagine a bunch of guys walking around, Chinook Havre area with these little orange pom-poms?
Well, what's been one of your most favorite reenactments?
Oh, goodness. Well, I have done stuff ranging from British Royal Navy to Texas Revolution to all sorts of things in between. But probably the most fun that I did was actually a Texas Revolution reenactment just a couple months ago. I portrayed a leading merchant of town. So I was all green tailcoat, little red vest, and fancy top hat, and I was giving toasts with everybody to, Texas Liberty and all this other stuff, and I'm not even Texan.
So, does the Hudson Bay just have history that you could research?
Yeah, Hudson Bay Company Archives in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I could probably spend the rest of my life just looking through their archives and still not see everything. So say what you will about the company, they were very adamant that they pretty much wrote everything they did down. They kept all their receipts. So we know exactly everything that they had, everything they shipped out or bought or lost.
And they don't mind sharing all that?
Nope, you just gotta go to Winnipeg or know somebody who is in Winnipeg. Because they don't have everything digitized. So.
From the time of 1853 to 55, when Stevens was first out there and prominent in making these treaties, until the retreat past the Civil War, and then subsequently finding the passes and where we go with other railroads. Did he revert back to something else and doing one of the other hats that he wore during that time?
So he was initially, basically the way he looked at it, he was the governor of Washington Territory. He looked at the railroad job as sort of his excuse to pay his way to his duty station. And along the way, he did his job as Indian Commissioner. So very interesting guy. There's a lot of books written on him that I highly recommend. He's one of my favorite characters. Well, I shouldn't say favorite because I actually like the guy as a person, but he's a very interesting figure. He was one of those that you either loved him or you hated him. And it seems that after a while, more people tended to hate him than love him. But absolutely interesting guy with a very expansive vision for what he thought the Northwest should be. But yeah. So he did serve as the governor, ended up getting himself kicked out of that job because everyone thought he was a bit of a little tyrant. Later ended up actually dying in the Civil War pretty early on. He became a general and was killed fighting the Confederates. So it would be interesting to see what the world would have looked like, well, what the West would have looked like, particularly had Stevens not died.
So did they follow Stevens's route for the Union Pacific Railroad?
So the Great Northern basically followed Stevens's route. A lot of the highways did too. Highway 2 follows the route that Stevens took. And I should mention, that was the fur traders trail prior to that. So Stevens wasn't really exploring anything that hadn't already been pioneered. It's just he's the one that really wrote about it. And they had these beautiful lithographs. John McStanley. All those images that I showed you there, they were done by John McStanley. He was a very prominent American artist who would probably be even more famous had 90% of his work not gone up in smoke about 10 years after he finished it. He donated a lot of his portraits and daguerreotypes. He took the first photographs in Montana, actually, and all of them were lost in a fire in 1865. Yeah, if I had a time machine, I would go back and I would stop that fire. Yeah, personally anyways. Just greatest loss to Montana history that we have ever had, and nobody really ever got the chance to know about it. But yeah, so that.
Thank you.
Well, thank you guys. I don't want to hold you hostage, but yeah.